All right. Well, everyone, it is past 5:30, so we'll get started. Thanks so much for showing up. Stewardship Hour. I'll start off by introducing myself. I am Emma Zarin Newman. I'm a third grade teacher at Matoka Elementary School, but I also volunteer as for the Clean County Commission. I serve as co-chair along with Peg Borman to promote environmental sustainability in James City County. One of the things we started once the pandemic hit was moving our Keep James City County Beautiful meetings kind of online, and with that came this educational component of the Stewardship Hour. We thought it was important for citizens to continue to interact with new concepts and new ideas that promote environmental sustainability, even when we can't physically all be together, hearing from these amazing speakers. But that has also lent itself to being able to hear from great people from different areas. It's made us able to connect with a bunch of different people who might otherwise find it difficult to meet up. So we're looking for the silver lining. We are here with the Stewardship Hour on this Zoom call every second Thursday of the month. So our next topic, food waste, we'll talk about on December 10th. So stay tuned for that. So here's a little bit about this Stewardship Hour deal. This is how we keep citizens informed about county sustainability. Like I said, it happens monthly. We focus on a particular subject, and we usually learn from an expert, which is the part I love the most. I love talking to people who know more than I do about this sort of stuff. It's amazing, so interesting. And this is also a forum where we can have meaningful conversations. If at any point during this presentation you have a question, please feel free to type it in the chat, and we will walk away with specific action steps. One thing that is unique about this Stewardship Hour is that I will be recording this entire Zoom session so that it can be shared on our county public access channel and the county YouTube channel. So this conversation will go well beyond the walls of this Zoom, which is great. Spreading the word about compost is something we all should care about. So today we're going to start by talking about compost. What is it? We're going to hear from our expert who's here today, Mr. Bruno Welsh. And then we'll jump into what action steps we can all be taking when it comes to compost. So today our learning objectives are: we will understand the ecological implications of composting food scraps and yard waste. We'll analyze the connection between individual actions and the environmental impact of landfill diversion, and we'll evaluate if small-scale composting is a system we can accept into our lifestyle. So before I pass it over to Bruno, I wanted to kind of get us ready for talking about compost by talking about what's the problem, first of all. And here's some facts you can read for yourself, but I'll read them out loud as well. The average household produces more than 200 pounds of kitchen waste every year. On average, Americans produce 4.5 pounds of trash every day. At least 2/3 of that is organic waste, including food scraps. In a landfill, organic waste decomposes anaerobically without oxygen, emitting a high volume of methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas and the primary contributor to climate change. And by not composting on small and large scales, we damage the quality of our soil and contribute to greenhouse gases. So compost is the action and end result of decomposing organic materials in their raw form, turning into vitally important soil amendment that improves the overall quality of the soil. So here's a diagram that really helps me understand composting when I started doing some more research. And there are references and more resources at the end of this presentation if you want to dive a little bit more into the science of composting on your own after everything you hear today. But I thought, if you wanted to glance over this, kind of paints a picture, but I do want to get into us talking to Bruno about composting because he knows a lot more than I do. So without further ado, we welcome Bruno from Compost RVA in Richmond to talk with us about compost. We've worked with Bruno in the past. He helped us have a compost bin at our most recent volunteer picnic that we host annually. And he was kind enough to let us have a bin so that our citizens could experience composting. And then he let us drive it up to him in Richmond so that we could do all that. And so we've had a great relationship since then, and he was more than happy to jump on board for our Zoom call today. So, Bruno, it's all yours.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming out tonight or logging on tonight. Let's see here. Yeah, so I've been doing composting since 2013 and exploring various ways of doing it, from event spaces to homes to different methods of composting, from fermentative composting to hot composting, cold composting, vermicomposting, just looking at different modalities to solve the same problem, but go at it in different ways that are sometimes effective on their own and sometimes better worked together. And like Emma said, composting has a lot of benefits to it, specifically dealing with waste mitigation, diversion of organic materials that can be used for future soil, for future growing medium, and specifically keeping out methane and carbon dioxide from landfill systems. The numbers you had there, I'm familiar with. Those are from originally from the EPA reports from I think it was 2005 to 2009, I believe. Somewhere in that range. And unfortunately, that report that used to be available has been taken down from the EPA's website. And last time I spoke to them a couple of years ago, they are in limbo. They're in the process.
Is it frozen for anyone else?
Yep.
Well, Bruno, we got
yes.
A little bit choppy. You were saying that you reached out to the EPA and they said they were in limbo about what?
Well, they were in the process of I chose the wrong word. They were in the process of trying to figure out what the new report would be. And that was 2 years ago. And considering what happened with items regarding climate change and, basically future green practices, I'm not exactly holding my breath for a new report, except, maybe in the next coming year, hopefully. Mm-hmm. The one from the early 2000s went into great detail about.
Bruno, I think we've lost you again.
Could be composted, and the particular issue there is methane gas is 4 times more volatile than greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Basically, the way to think about it is the amount of gas of carbon dioxide in, let's say, a balloon, the amount of heat energy that passes through there, if it was a balloon full of methane, is 4 times greater, or is 4 times greater in terms of how much more strongly it doesn't allow passage. So methane gas that's produced quite largely in landfill systems is one of those gases that we really want to keep down as much as possible. And in composting, we do have amounts of carbon dioxide and methane, but they're so small comparatively that it's accepted as a detail in the process.
Mm. And this is my understanding that through proper soil health, which would involve composting, it might keep those harmful gases sort of contained in their natural system and not necessarily in the atmosphere. Is that, or at least with a healthy root system? Am I phrasing that correctly? Probably dumbed that down a little too much, but oh no, we're frozen again.
Okay, can you hear me?
Now I can, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry, what was the question?
Is it true that through composting and through healthy soil, basically we can keep those greenhouse gases, more contained in the soil, in the root systems, and in the plants in the healthy way that's intended?
Correct. Yes. I mean, and mainly the idea there is you're looking at not only the breaking down of the process in terms of breaking it down into soil and then having that carbon material stay in the soil itself, but then also you're benefiting the soil in being more healthy, which means that you would have healthier plants and healthier trees who sequester that carbon dioxide that's in the air. So you're going at multiple levels of the puzzle by doing the composting. You're fitting things together basically. So you get as a result of it benefit of the wildlife that you get around it. The pictures that I sent you there on the left hand side, if you blow it up, there's actually a bunch of bees all over the top of the compost, and that was from recent orchard picking, and the apples that were thrown there onto the compost brought in quite a large number of bees. So then that was bringing in pollinators to our, and this is actually in our backyard, to our backyard. And you have this whole cycle of the compost is breaking down, it's breaking down the organic material, you're benefiting the sequestration of carbon dioxide and methane, and then at the same time you're bringing in pollinators. And the pollinators too, one of the things is a lot of times we associate bees and birds as the primary pollinators, but flies and I believe even mosquitoes are qualified as pollinators. So even when you look at composting at times being a nuisance in terms of pests that may be around, all of those things benefit in some way, either directly in terms of pollinating the plants and nature that we have around us, to being an attractant to wildlife coming in.
Thank you. Bruno, can I ask you, you mentioned a few different types of composting. Would you mind talking about how there are different types of composting and maybe an overview of what they are? And
Yeah. So we have, so in the picture as well, there's the cluster of mushrooms, the fungi there. That's one form of composting where you are using, excuse me, we're using a fungus of some sort to break down materials. In that case, it's usually on a smaller scale. However, even though you're talking about mushrooms breaking down things, they have an immense mitigation factor in terms of pollutants. There's actually interesting study that you can find where there was oil slick a number of years back that was cleaned up using repurposed hair from a hairstylist, and the hair was soaked with oil from the slick. And then they reached out to Berkeley University, who their soil scientist inoculated hay bales, introduced the hair. Then the mushrooms that were created from that consumed the hair and the oil that was there, and not only broke it down, but broke it down into mushrooms that eventually were safe enough to consume. One aspect of composting with the remediation in there as well. And then we also have hot composting, which in general is going to be compost that involves aerobic bacteria. It can involve anaerobic as well, but in general, we think of it as aerobic bacteria, where you are creating temperatures in excess of 100 to 140, even up to 160. Generally, you don't want to get above 140 because a lot of times there can be spontaneous combustion and stuff like that. But on the flip end of that, that is compost that's going to be made very quickly. So if you're trying to get rid of a lot of mass very quickly, you want to go the route of hot composting. However, at the same time, you're not getting the same yield of product. So that's one advantage and disadvantage to hot composting. Then cold composting is what a lot of people call lazy composting, where you have a pile that is not being burned. There's not a lot of movement going on within it. There's not a lot of heat coming off of it. It stays relatively low. But at the same time, as a result of the lower heat, you're having the lower temperature, you're having more cases of a bacteria in particular called actinomycetes. And that's a very important bacteria for soil health. So that one typically takes much longer. That's going to be composting more like you find in a forest bed. However, that's also going to be a bulkier compost and in general a little bit fluffier. It's just going to take, in general, somewhere around a year, possibly less, but in general, it takes much longer than a hot composting system. Then you have vermicomposting, which is composting using worms. In the United States, typically we use Icenia fetida or earthworms. Icenia fetida is the species. However, in the United States alone, we have over 100 species of worms that are mostly species. So that also brings in its own issues in terms of doing vermicomposting. Vermicomposting is great for the type of compost it produces because the worms have a particular bacteria in their intestinal tract that when it goes into your soil system, it helps plants grow dramatically. There was a study done, I believe it was Stanford University, that has some video and imaging of it. But at the same time, with vermicomposting, in general, you don't want to do meats and things like that require sterile temperatures in order to take care of possible disease vectors from being produced, for it to be a disease vector. It's going to be a cooler to a degree. Think about like kimchi or sauerkraut or pickling. And what you're doing there is you're introducing an anaerobic bacteria. In certain instances, it's lactic acid bacteria, or it could be acetic acid. Like, for instance, if you're doing kombucha, stuff like that, basically, where what you are doing is...
Hold on, we lost your audio, Bruno.
Or more precisely. And in that case, even though you have to be concerned about it being in a container, one of the advantages to doing fermentative composting is that depending on what you are breaking down, you can actually produce methane gas in large enough amounts that it can actually be extracted from the compost and used directly as a fuel source. So, for each of the types of composting, there's benefits and hindrances, but at the same time, there's also real world applications of like ways to create an energy source or ways to alleviate, environmental contamination, stuff like that.
That's so interesting. I was actually just reading that in Canada, there are some areas that are using that type of compost to harness the methane for that energy source. It's so interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. I would like to. Oh, are there? I don't mean.
Yeah,
to,
I mean, yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, you go.
Okay. I was gonna
say, I don't know if they're still doing it. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, all you.
Oh, sorry, the audio was kind of tripping there. Well, I was just going to mention really quick, in New Jersey, there's actually examples of where they have big, massive digesters that do it anaerobically, and they're able to extract large amounts of that gas as well.
Wow, that is so interesting. Again, if you guys have questions, please type them in the chat. We'll get to them in just a minute. I want to go through our actions and talk about those for just a second, and then we'll cycle back to Bruno, and we'll get to maybe talk to Glen a little bit about what they're doing over there as well. So this is the segment where we take, we've just learned a lot about composting, all the various types of composting. I didn't know about half of those. That's awesome. We're going to talk about an individual behavior change we can all make, how we can contact the powers that be to make systemic change in the favor of compost, how we can support the economy and our local businesses, how we can what volunteer actions we can take, and of course, one of the actions you can always take is sharing the video of this Zoom and having people listen to Bruno's wealth of knowledge and get exposed to these actions. So let me just say after this presentation, if you'd like me to send you the PDF of this presentation, all the things written in purple are clickable links where you can go and, for example, watch this video where this man from Better Homes and Gardens talks about how you can use soil from your own personal compost in your garden and how that helps your plants. So, of course, our individual behavior change would be to consider starting your own compost system at home or with an organization you work with. I found this blurb and I liked it. It says, by composting, we can individually, dramatically reduce the unnecessary food and yard waste that we generate, keeping it out of the solid waste stream and thereby saving landfill space and reducing methane production in landfills. And we can save ourselves some money by avoiding disposal fees. So some quick information about how to get this started for yourself. One of the things, the composting basics are knowing the difference. If you're just going to do this on your own without the machinery that Bruno has access to, you need to know about your brown and your green. When you're composting, you make sure that you put these into your bin in a ratio of 3-to-1. So you make sure you have plenty of brown to offset the green to maintain the right amount of airflow and the right amount of bacteria, the right temperature. So if you don't get a good mix of these materials, and if anyone knows, if anyone sees anything that they disagree with and they know more than me, please call it out. Your compost pile may not heat up if you don't have this ratio. It might take forever to break down, and it can start stinking up the place. So for anyone who's afraid of the compost being overly stinky, this is probably what's going wrong if your compost is starting to smell too funky. Bruno, you have a comment?
Yeah, so this is one thing that a lot of people get tied up on, is making sure the ratio is exactly 3-to-1. And the problem with the 3-to-1 or any of the ratios is depending on who's teaching it. A lot of times they're talking about like volume, but then other times they're talking about carbon to nitrogen ratio. And the problem there is that like you have to have an intimate knowledge of like how much carbon does pine have versus like a hardwood, or how much, like for instance, the example I like to give to people is urine is a 1-to-1 ratio of carbon to nitrogen. It's very high in nitrogen. Whereas if you're going to deal with like an apple or seaweed or something like that, it's going to be a different ratio. It's going to be a larger ratio. And what I like to tell folks is basically think, as far as the ratio goes, think about it like if you were making bread or baking cookies, and you have to mix your dry and your wet. So your dry goods are going to be your carbon material. So it's going to be your leaves, your brown matter, your wood chips, stuff like that. And then your green is going to be your liquid material, and that's going to be your spinach, your seaweed, your meats, your dairy, your cheeses, all that stuff. And you basically want to mix them to the point where they kind of saturate in a way that they look like a mixed thing, like there's not too much of one and too much of the other. And as far as the smell stuff, the big points to take away are if it smells really funky, then there's too much nitrogen and you need to add more nitrogen or more carbon. And if it's really dry and you notice that there's like ants in particular nesting in your compost, then that means it needs more nitrogen. And if you smell an ammonia smell, that means that your compost needs to be turned, because what's happening is the nitrogen that's within your compost pile is turning into ammonia. And that's the nitrogen literally turning into a gas and leaving your compost. And also it's not a great greenhouse gas to have, but it's also a good indicator as far as like, oh, something's not going right with my compost. I need to turn it. And as far as turning it, what I highly recommend, I learned this a few years back on a video, was get a cheap piece of rebar. It's much more effective to get down into a big compost pile than using a pitchfork. Whereas a pitchfork, you only go as deep as the tines will let you.
Awesome. Thank you, Bruno. I really appreciate knowing that. That makes a lot more sense putting in the context of baking. So here are some ideas. If anyone wanted to embark on this journey, you might invest in. I would recommend looking on the internet. If you have a higher budget, there's some pretty amazing things out there when it comes to your own backyard compost bin. But on the other note, if you're looking into some lower budget options, there are some ways to get creative. But I would definitely do your research before going for a bin that you keep in your freezer to dump somewhere else. Make sure you're doing your research so that you're going to be doing, the process correctly. Bruno, go for it.
Sorry. This is just one really big one. When you're going for the higher budget ones, a lot of times the tumbler systems, those are the ones that are basically a barrel, and then they're on a triangle, two-post triangle axis that you turn over or you spin. Be careful with those. If you can buy them in person, I highly recommend that. And also measure how large your shovel is before you go buy it. Because what often happens that I've seen with those companies is they sell a really expensive compost bin, and then they make a really tiny door that's virtually impossible to get your compost out of it when it's done. It's one of my pet peeves.
Are these the ones you're talking about that kind of look like that?
Yes.
Okay.
Some of them make really great ones that like the whole thing slides open and everything comes out. But some of the other ones make these just ridiculously tiny things that like you could barely fit a kid's hand in there. And they expect you to take everything out of like a 30-gallon thing through a tiny little porthole. And it's just a really bad. So those are very functional because what they're doing is they're introducing loads and loads of oxygen inside of a compost bin. And that's what you want. Composting is basically a digestive process, the same way that we're able to digest foods using oxygen, acids, and different fermentative processes. That's what basically a tumbler is doing, where all this oxygen is getting pumped into there while it's getting turned, and then all the bacteria is going in there. But the problem is basically the exit for that system oftentimes is really prohibitive. And so many times I've seen people buy the tumbler systems and then they trash them or they break apart because they never use them because it's not functional.
Right. Thank you for that. It's good to know.
You're welcome.
All right. And so here are just some quick tips and tricks for starting your own compost. Empty kitchen scraps often to avoid bad odors and bugs in your kitchen. Turn or mix the yard compost once a week for optimal results. chop up your kitchen scraps to speed up that composting process. Interested in organic soil, then make sure your scraps are organic or separate your scraps. And onion and garlic scraps may repel earthworms. So if you're trying to attract earthworms, then that would not be a great scrap to throw in there. We did have some questions, but I'm going to get to them at the end, but they do relate to this. We'll get back. We're sort of running out of time, so I'm going to move it along. You might not know yet, but James City County is making plans for a new convenience center in Grove. So the Grove Convenience Center, and the county would like citizen input. So if you think that composting might be something that you'd like to see involve the county put their effort behind and to make this more of a systemic approach, then please go and give your thoughts on this input form. This is where citizens can be heard on what matters to them, and the county is going to be reading this over and trying to understand what do the people want before they actually design the system and design the convenience center. So please put in your input if that's something you'd like to be in this new convenience center. The next piece, we always talk about how to support the economy. I would just put out there that you should definitely ask your local businesses if they compost, because you might be surprised how many do, even though we don't have a system here. We have Glen Lavender tonight here again, back for more for this from the Stewardship Hour. Glen, do you want to say a few words about the composting that you guys are doing over there?
Yeah, sure. So for me, composting it's been a thing forever. And it's not even like been an option. It's just sort of like when you're working in the kitchen at home and you've got vegetables or anything, obviously they don't go in the garbage because that's a waste. I can use them. They'll turn into soil eventually. It's also not going to take up space in the garbage landfill system. So that's sort of why it's always just been a thing for us for a long time. So when we started the Meadery and we were making these honey wines with 150 pounds of strawberries, the strawberries would sit in the tank for a week, 2 weeks, and then we'd take them out, and they would basically be spent of all of their flavor and color. And I was excited because now I've got this all this stuff to add to my compost. I can fill it up. So I was actually bringing all the compost from the Meadery to my backyard composter, which is not that big at home, but it moved so quick. It never filled up. Like it's maybe this bit larger than a standard spirits barrel, and but I never fill it. It just keeps working and working and working. So since then, as we've kind of grown, we've started a compost back here on the property, and that's where we're just putting things. We're not it's not operating as well as I'd like, not as well as my home composter, because we have chickens there too, and I'm able to use some of that chicken the waste or the cedar chips that we clean out, and I'll usually throw that on top of whatever I've added in, and that's made for some awesome compost, as well as my sourdough starter. When I'm discarding it, also brings some interesting characters into the composter that I'm often feeding my chickens too. So anyway, that being said, when I heard you were talking about compost, I was very excited because it's a fun thing. So yeah, we're doing it. We're doing it as best as we can here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Glen.
Yeah.
Bruno comes to us too from Compost RVA. I know we've mentioned that before, so I put his information on this slide if you wanted to reach out to him for any more of his business needs. Thanks again. So the fourth action we can take is volunteer action. There is a subcommittee as a part of Keep James City County Beautiful called the R3 subcommittee. It stands for Reduce, Reuse, and Recycle. Through this committee, you can help educate the citizens of the county about reducing, reusing, and recycling. You can think through impactful changes to solid waste management. You can gather citizen input for more effective programs. So this is a very important subcommittee, and it definitely needs members and fresh energy so we can think about things like composting in the county. And the fifth action would be to share the video of this Zoom. So please fill out our exit ticket at the end of this presentation and share the Zoom video and the PowerPoint with anyone who might be interested to learn more. Okay, without further ado, here is our exit ticket. If you look at this presentation as a PDF, you can click right on the click here sign, or if you're in the Zoom right now, you can go to our the SurveyMonkey link in the chat right now. So on this, you're going to have a pop quiz to see what you remember of what Bruno said today. You're going to you can receive a copy of this presentation or video by letting me know through the survey. You can sign up for emails about Keep James City County Beautiful, and you can commit to action. So here are some resources to give you some more information about composting. There's some documentaries, some videos, some articles, some news from a town that Glenn used to live in that he sent me. He and his wife sent me to read about this town. Very interesting, actually. There's some information about composting and a really interesting nonprofit in Haiti where they're trying to regenerate the soil through composting as sort of a long-term impact nonprofit organization. All right, join us next time for food waste on the Stewardship Hour, organized by the Clean County Commission of James City County, and we'll see you there on December 10th at 5:30 p.m. on Zoom. Before we sign off, though, there was a question for Bruno in the chat about rodents. Are rodents attracted to compost?
Yes, sometimes.
Is there anything that people can do to mitigate that or protect against
Yes. Yeah. So the big thing that I tell everybody is if you have rodents, they weren't created by your compost. They were attracted, which means that something else already brought them over there. And that could be anything from, land mismanagement to somebody's dumpster of trash luring them over. And then all of a sudden your compost bin becomes the blame. But at the same time, one of the common rodents that we get in Virginia is the opossum, which is a beneficial rodent because it also eats a huge amount of ticks. But that being said, as far as keeping rodents out, like I mentioned earlier, as far as turning your compost, if you make sure that as much of it as possible is turned and aerated, therefore keeping the temperature up, that can mitigate the amount of rodents you have. If you have a closed bin compost, that can help. And not just rodents, you can have pests. So like things like roaches or gnats, things like that. If you're doing a vermicompost and you're having an issue of gnats or little bugs like that, one thing that can help is if you put in a small cup of apple cider vinegar, or you can use diatomaceous earth sprinkled in there. It's not great for the worms, but it can help keep out those other pests temporarily. And in general, the worms will kind of run and do their own thing. If you're doing a bin outside and you're noticing that there's rodents coming into there, using some sort of wire mesh usually helps. But at the same time, if it's a rodent that really wants to get in, it's going to get in regardless. So one thing that you can also do is you can make a simple pepper spray with the hottest pepper you can get, mix it with some water and spray it onto your compost every once in a while. Wearing a mask or glasses while you do that, because the same way that it hurts them, it can hurt you. Making sure that you're mixing things properly. So let's say you just threw out a hunk of meat or a hunch of meat or bones or even fruit apple peels like I did, that attracted the bees. Whereas if I didn't want that to happen, I could have covered the meats as well to mask the smell as much as possible. Another thing that you can do is certain things you can add into there are very good at masking smell. In particular, if you have a roastery near you, the coffee chaff, which is the leftover material from the roasting process, is very good at masking. And it also works well in the garden, and it's a really good carbon source. And there's all sorts of things, like when you start trying to figure out how to mix and find carbon sources for your compost. I would look at a lot of businesses that you show patronage to locally that may be roasting or grinding or doing some sort of creation on their own, that they have this waste product that they simply don't know what to do. Like the gentleman earlier from the Meadery was talking about, they have that waste product, the strawberries, which is a high nitrogen source. So if you needed a lot of nitrogen, that would be something that you could go to, is looking for places that produce large amounts, like juicing companies, cideries, meaderies, breweries, anybody that needs large bulk material like that they use. And then at the end is just is basically just a nutrients to add into something, in particular your compost.
Wow. Thank you so much, Bruno. And then there was another question about meeting HOA standards. I'd say that that's between you and your HOA. Every HOA is going to be a little different about something like composting. But if you find that that's something your HOA seems to be very against, then it might be worth sitting down and having a conversation with the people in your HOA.
Yeah. In general, like I've had an issue with HOA before with one of my clients, where I built a tumbler bin for them, because before that they were doing just a compost on their yard. And it was completely exposed. So, I mean, something was bound to come to it. But like I said, if it's a case of it attracting things, those things were already in the neighborhood or whatever. But if you're looking for smells and stuff like that, then doing some sort of closed system is the easiest way to make everybody happy. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to do a closed system, one inexpensive way to do it is using pallet wood, which a lot of times people can get for free. The one big caveat there is to make sure that it is heat treated pallet wood, and that also if you can find out what was being held on the pallet wood, because the heat treated hasn't been sprayed with chemicals to make it, they haven't been sprayed with fungicides or pesticides. However, the flip end of that can also be, let's say it was heat treated wood and it was carrying, barrels of Roundup or barrels of oil, or just something that, if the wood was contaminated with that, even if the wood wasn't processed, it now has that material soaked into it. So that's one of the things I recommend also for folks when you're looking for inexpensive ways. The pallets are a lot of the ways that people go, but you have to be very careful, because that wood will eventually break down, and you want to make sure the wood's as clean as possible.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Bruno.
Yeah, thank you
for all your time and knowledge. And thanks everyone else for coming. It's a great stewardship hour as always.